ask a room full of people about the season of Lent, and a few topics are likely to come up. You might hear about ashes. You might hear about absent alleluias. You might hear about the color purple. You might hear about any of those things, but you are almost sure to hear about giving things up. It's a time-honored tradition in much of the church to give something up during these 40 days of Lent. And there are lots of reasons for that. Jesus gave up just about everything for 40 days when the Spirit drove him into the wilderness. And Lent is now a season for fasting, a season for that particular spiritual practice of going without in the interest of a greater good. So people give up all kinds of things this season. Chocolate or wine or Facebook. Lauren Winner, an author I admire, has talked about some of the less common fasts she has tried during this season. One year she gave up reading as much as she could in the interest of listening more. One year she gave up saying yes for Lent, which probably isn't a bad spiritual discipline for those of us who tend to overcommit and find ourselves stretched too thin in the process. One year she made an attempt to give up fear for Lent, to simply say no to that anxiety that goes so much against the gospel, but is still so much a part of life for many of us. I don't know if you are giving anything up for Lent this year, but in the gospel reading we heard this morning, Peter is asked, or more like forced, to give something up. And it's something a lot more difficult than giving up a favorite sitcom for 40 days. Peter is asked to give up a false idea of who Jesus is. We shouldn't be too hard on Peter for this, I think. Nobody saw this coming. In Mark's telling of the story, Jesus has been on this incredible roll lately. In the last chapter or so, he has brought hearing to a man born deaf and sight to one born blind. He's fed thousands on the hillside with a few loaves of bread. He's captivated everybody around him with his authoritative teaching. He's doing everything that a full-fledged Messiah-type person should be doing. And Peter gets that. So he gets the answer right when Jesus asks that big question, "Who do you say that I am?" "You're the Messiah," Peter blurts out. And a great silence must have hung in the air around those words of deep truth spoken for the very first time. Peter gets it. Jesus is the Messiah, the one everybody has been waiting for. But he doesn't get the kind of Messiah that Jesus is. And how could he? Everybody was expecting a powerful king, or at least a general with an army behind him. So when Jesus tells the disciples what kind of Messiah he is, one who will be rejected, who will suffer and die, Peter and Jesus end up in their famous shouting match, each rebuking the other. This was a tough day for Peter, and not only because Jesus calls him Satan. He's asked to give up a false idea of who Jesus is, and then he's asked to give up himself. I don't care what you're giving up this Lent. It can't be as hard as all that. Nobody wanted Jesus to talk this way. The disciples would rather have had Jesus talk like a politician hungry for approval, promising victory, promising enemies on the run, promising a swift and decisive end to everything that stood in the people's way. And truth be told, I suppose there are times when I wish for Jesus to talk a little bit more like that too. When I wish God would simply do away with Ebola and the suffering it continues to inflict. When I wish God would intervene and stop ISIS from taking more captives and brutally destroying one more community. When I wish God would put an end to hunger or to climate change. When it would be nice to hear that God was on the warpath against everything or everyone I consider an enemy. But of course, in Jesus, we don't get that kind of God. And so in him, we don't get that kind of discipleship either. Instead, we get a word that following Jesus is about picking up the cross that's in front of you. That we only find life when we give it away. In a recent column, David Lose called this section of Mark the Gospel's theory of everything. And in a real way, it is. This is where we get what the whole story is really about. This business about life and death, finding and losing, is what our life in the world comes down to. And here in the middle of Lent, all of that can probably sound perfectly pious and proper and churchy. All this serious language about hearing about crosses being borne brings to mind images of saints and martyrs, people who have literally lost their lives in following the paths the gospel laid out for them. People whose lives we admire, but people whose spiritual lives can seem unattainably holy and distant. But I actually think we know this deep down. I actually think we do know something about what it means to find our lives in losing them. For starters, we know the story around us, repeated over and over again. The story that you find your life in filling it up. Filling it up with one more material comfort, with one more promotion at work, with one more thrill, one more vacation, one more drink. We all know that story, repeated to us in 100 different ways every day. And we also know something else. We know that it's not true. That while those things may not be bad in and of themselves, while promotions can be beneficial and vacations can be fun, none of these things actually helps us find what we most wish for. They don't help us find meaning and belonging and purpose and joy. Cram as much stuff in as you can, and the answer is still the same. We simply don't find ourselves in being filled up. We all know that. And we also know something else. We know that we find life in making room for others. You know this from your friendships. You know they don't grow without listening, without being available, without paying attention, putting down your own agenda in order to be present to another person. If you're a parent, you know this from your children. You know that setting aside your own wishes from time to time, for solitude, for sleep, for a grown-up conversation, is sometimes what you have to do. Children are very good teachers that way. You know this from being part of a community. You know that we don't find ourselves here by jockeying for our own positions, demanding things be run the way we want, filling ourselves up. We find ourselves here by making space for others, by letting their stories shape and move us, by giving ourselves away. And maybe this is something of what Jesus meant in talking about taking up your cross. If we follow in his footsteps, we are bound to be asked to confront that great lie again and again, that we find ourselves in being filled up. We're bound to be asked instead to look outside, to cease that restless business of grabbing for more, even to allow those parts of us that resist mercy and grace to be killed. Let's say it very clearly, though. Jesus isn't asking anybody to passively endure abuse. He doesn't mean that we should accept neglect or violence or injustice that's inflicted on us. There is a world of difference between freely giving yourself away and being abused by others against your will. Jesus never condoned the latter, and we can't either. Instead, years ago, Dorothy Day said it this way: "We have all known the long loneliness, and we have learned that the only solution is love, and that love comes with community. In the midst of all the lies that we are told, the lies that we will find ourselves when we're finally filled up full enough, this is the gospel's piercing word of truth. The solution to the long loneliness to the search for meaning and peace that we all know, every one of us, is love. And that's how love works. It makes room. It gives itself away. You never have to look hard for occasions to live this out. Crosses will certainly come. Times when you are asked to give yourself away in the interest of others. A little later on in the service, on the way to the communion table, you will be invited to follow in Peter's footsteps, to walk this wilderness path, and to pick up a cross to keep with you during the season of Lent, a reminder of that call to follow. Yes, this is the hard edge of following Jesus, the cost of discipleship, as Dietrich Bonhoeffer famously put it. And it is also, at just the same time, the great gift. Because it is here that we are promised to find life that is full and free. And it is here that we are promised to find Jesus, bearing always beside us. Amen.